Well, thank you very much for giving me the last slot, almost, of the conference. Thank you for your introduction, Mr. Chairman, and to Marcus and Torsten for the invitation from Interpret Europe and from AHI. It's really an honour and a privilege for me to be here, and also, quite good for me too. I'm normally running conferences, so it's been quite good to be at a conference for a change. But thanks also to you, hardy souls, who've made it this far. I heard it was quite a late night last night, and you're in a nice, dark, warm, comfortable room in big, comfortable chairs, so you will be forgiven if some of you nod off. I hope I've got a few things to say that might keep you alert and awake. So I want to obviously just reflect on the topic of your conference, but first of all, I kind of need to get the advertisement over. Who is the EUROPARC Federation? I've been asked that question several times over the last few days. And we are the largest protected area network in Europe, perhaps even the world, I think. We have about 400 members, which is actually thousands of protected areas across 37 countries in Europe. What is a protected area? I spent a long time in Norway giving a presentation for about an hour, 45 minutes. I won't do that today, hopefully. Talking about protected areas, and the first question at the end was, what is a protected area? Oh, dearie me. So we're talking about parks, nature parks, regional parks, geoparks, World Heritage Sites, Ramsar sites. So for quickness, I'll just say protected areas. We're here to, our members are all of those parts, and we're here to support and advise, train, and seek to improve the standards and policy and practice of protected areas. We lobby and represent our members at a European level. We're a platform for experience exchange in order to innovate and improve our work. We are there to support parks, to protect nature by bringing people together from both inside and out with the parks. Now, our mission is that of sustainable nature that's valued by people, because nature knows no boundaries. So EUROPARC was founded on the principle, that the future of protection and conservation of nature is achieved through international cooperation, something you're doing here today as well. But the international cooperation works best through personal contact. A lot of personal contact, I think, was made on the dance floor last night. But through that personal contact comes that mutual understanding, that shared experience, and the knowledge and innovation. Because that delivers the better support and management of our protected areas, which ensures the future protection and conservation of our nature, and of course our cultural heritage too, because nature knows no boundaries. How do we go about doing that? Well, we develop management programs in topics that range across the breadth of protected area work, from sustainable tourism to transboundary to working with youth and through our Junior Ranger programme. And I was just saying to Torsten there, I hope he enjoys the book that he won in the auction the other night on Europe's nature and landscape parks. That's a seminal work that we've just produced with our partners. Now, you'll hear me say protected areas, nature, landscape throughout my presentation. For those from the built and cultural heritage, I hope you just reinsert your appropriate words throughout my discussion here. And of course, I'm also shamelessly going to advertise next year's conference of EUROPARC here, or close by here in the Cairngorms National Park. I'm very proud that our council members of the EUROPARC Federation voted to bring our conference to Scotland, despite the Brexit vote, even though Scotland didn't vote for Brexit. Because they really wanted to show solidarity between our European partners and those of us on the island here. And I hope that is something that we can share with our friends in Interpret Europe, because I certainly would like to make sure that there's a space for interpretation in our conference next year. And I would very warmly like to invite both members and chairman and management of Interpret Europe to join us next year and to look at how we can bring interpretation and park management a bit closer together. I think we have a space to do that. If you want to find anything more about EUROPARC, about our conference, please just pop onto our website and follow. I think I should be doing that thing. Subscribe here, share, like on all of our social media platforms, I think is the common parlance that we should use. Now, you've heard that, and I think you can hear that I'm Scottish. I make no apologies for it. And I come from Stirling, which is right in the middle of Scotland, where might be the capital of the Highlands. Stirling is known as the gateway to the Highlands, and if you came by train or car up to here, you would have passed by it. It's the ancient capital of Scotland. It's an iconic, historic location and landscape embedded in the psyche of the Scottish people. It's the home to one of our Scottish heroes, William Wallace, who most of you, I think, know as Braveheart. It's also the home of Bannockburn, and you heard, I think, Drew the other day talking about one of the big HLF interpretation projects at the Bannockburn battle site there. And for those of you of another ilk, it's also a lot of the locations where Outlander was filmed as well. So it's famous on very many levels. And I said I'd like to introduce you to a very little-known Scottish hero. Well, he's so little known that he's really only known to my family, because that's my granddad, Ritchie, the man who was the guide in Stirling Castle. Stirling Castle, a place where history, culture and landscape really intersect. So I think, as you said, I think I pretty much have him to blame for the communication and interpretation route that my life took as an ecologist, a teacher, a ranger, a park manager, and somehow has brought me here. But in the spirit of gender equality, I should also introduce you to my granny. This is my mum's mum, my granny Ramsay, because she came from Ardesseer in Fort George, which is just up the road here in Inverness. So my DNA is pretty much from this area too. Now, these people came from the end of the 19th century. They were born in the late 1800s. And I think my generation, and possibly most of us in this room, yes, that is me, are the last people to be physically connected from the people of that century. Now, the landscape, the physical, cultural and political landscape that they knew, in some ways is both the same, but in very, very different to that which I grew up in. The physical place is the same. The Wallace Monument is still there. The Ochels, the Pictish Fort on the top of the Myatt, Stirling Castle, the River Forth, the Gatheringstane, they're all still there. But the cultural and political landscape that I inhabit is very different from that they lived in. I have their knowledge, their language, their habits, their customs and cultures, but my sense of the landscape that they inhabited is less concrete. But of course, if there's one thing we do know about history, is it does repeat itself. And here I am, some 50 years after he died, leading the procession of dignitaries into Stirling Castle during the International Ranger Federation Congress in 2006, just very much in the same way as my granddad would have done with his visitors much earlier. Now, my connection to landscape took me from playing in Stirling Castle to a very traditional Scottish seaside holidays, where my penchant for beaches, which I talked about in Janja's workshop the other day, and obviously digging them up a little bit there, started. Why my parents chose to dress me up as a Victorian child in the 1960s, I'll never know. But I was very proud of my reading and my book prizes, as you can see very much there in the shadow of the Wallace Monument. We were lucky enough to have summer holidays in exotic beach resorts, enjoying the paddle boats, where people spoke in a very strange foreign voice. Yes, Arbroath was the holiday destination of choice for the Ritchie family. And again, here I am digging up the beach again. And I could never really resist a swing. But those green lines of connectivity of the landscape and the cultural landscape really is part of me, is part of my DNA and part of my experiences that pretty much led me to here. But it led me to consider the topic of your conference about what is culture and landscape, And we've heard these days that it's nature and history combined. And I'd like to add a little bit of nurture in there too. And that's what creates these living, working landscapes, or indeed seascapes, that we've heard about over these past few days. So I'd like to consider, what is that cultural landscape, and how can we as interpreters help to connect people to those places? Okay, so I did say I would introduce you to a Scottish hero. Thankfully not another member of my family, you'll be relieved to hear, but not this guy either. I think we've heard enough about John Muir, both here and in previous, I'm sure, conferences. But I'd like to introduce you to this guy, Patrick Geddes. How many of you know of Patrick Geddes and his work? Wow, for most times when I ask that question, there is no hands. So the fact that there's half a dozen hands, thank you. You can maybe help share this knowledge with the rest of the people in the room. So he was born in Ballater in the Cairngorms National Park, not that very far from here. And he's another of those guys with crazy hair and beard. But despite that, he was an all-round interesting guy. And in his day, he really came up with some very radical and some very future-looking ideas. But his work has pretty much been lost, certainly in Scotland, and as I can see from the few hands in the audience, around most of the rest of the world too. But I think that the thinking that he brought really resonates with us still today, not just in his main area of work, which is town planning and regional planning, but I think also in protected area management, in landscape design, and, more importantly for you guys, in interpretation too. With the current issues in society of urbanisation, of the disconnect from nature and landscape, I think it's useful for us to look back to the future to see what inspiration Patrick Geddes can bring us. So I'll give you a quick Patrick Geddes 101 just in the next couple of slides. He created a model for planning. As you can see, it's quite, I think, elegant in its work. He really brought about those ideas of place, of work, and of folk. It was about understanding the relationship with the land. It's composed of our acts, our deeds, our facts that we know of, and our thoughts and dreams. He connected the human psyche with the physical world, and I think he expressed it quite elegantly. He linked the economic activities to the physical environment as well. And he saw that the nature of the work in the future might change, but the interdependency of them and of them to the land doesn't. This is his valley section, as it's known. He developed a process of management, which I think is particularly relevant in interpretation. Sympathy, synthesis, and synergy. To have sympathy for the people and the environment. The synthesis of all of the factors relevant, and the synergy, the combined cooperative action of everyone involved in order to do something, to precipitate a change. He talked about a philosophy of learning, vivendo decimus. I do love my Latin. By living, we learn. And I think for most of us in interpretation, to learn from the hand, from the heart, and from the head, I think is embedded in what we're trying to do as interpreters. This was the last century. We're only just rediscovering this now, or have done in the last decades. He also created constellation theory, looking at the influence of cities and their environs. And he really laid down the principles of what we now think of as placemaking, which I think we can think of as landscape making. And believe it or not, he's even attributed with think global, act local, something we kind of just say and take for granted these days. And I'm really glad that in Edinburgh there's going to be a new Patrick Geddes Centre, which will really bring his thinking and his work back into the current thinking. Because he realised that to affect the land, it was more about the psychology of the people than the ecology of the plants and animals. And I think all of this is very relevant to our consideration, not just of park management, but of interpretation, both in the present and in the future. Now, John Muir may have been the father of national parks. He certainly gave the idea of their protection. But I think Patrick Geddes is more like the crazy uncle, who I think more importantly gave us the processes of management. And I'd like you to perhaps consider, as I take you on a bit of a whirlwind photo tour around Europe, some of these Geddes ideas. Because Europe is a variety of landscapes embedded in our cultural identities. They've been sculpted by nature and shaped by people. They've influenced the course of history, inspired artists and thinkers, and enriched our lives. They are our natural life support system. And the protected areas, of course, which are inside these landscapes, represent the land, which is our inheritance. And we hold it in trust for those who come after us. Now, we are a part of nature. We are not apart from it. But I think that understanding, that value, is something that's lost in current society. Really, we're living in a time where we're in the dominance of the economic value of things. Appreciating the value of nature is, for me, the first act towards creating a sustainable world. And of course, I mean the intrinsic value of nature, but of course there is an economic element to that. Because understanding, appreciating, and valuing something enough to then care, to change how we manage and use our natural resources, I think is a necessity for our world. And interpretation has a fundamental and significant role to aid that understanding, to show these values, and importantly, to stimulate the change. Of course, the wealth of a nation is dependent on the wealth of its nature and the health of its nature. Because nature can often leave us with a sense of awe and a sense that it's almost ethereal and intangible. And I think that's wholly a good thing, that we are awestruck. But placing a value on nature and measuring its value to society is something that's quite challenging, I think particularly to those of us in the natural heritage community. But we do need to improve our understanding of how economics and the natural environment and the well-being of society are interlinked. And many of our members inside EUROPARC have really had a good go at that. You heard Pete on Wednesday talk about that from the Cairngorms National Park perspective, that they have 1.8 million visitors who bring £209 million into their economy. And here in Wales, in their report on Open for Business, they've shown many of the economic and social factors that the national parks of Wales bring, showing £1 billion worth of spending in from the three national parks of Wales. Finland too have done a lot of work in this area through visitor surveys and other evaluations year upon year. And they're able to show that for every euro invested in a national park, you get 10 euros in return. That's better than a lottery ticket. That we are living in a very changing landscapes, in a very changing world with changing climate is evident, I think. That something is happening to the climate, and it's got something to do with us, and we kind of have to do something about it. I think it's generally accepted in society, unless of course you're Donald Trump, because he only really understands the language of tweet. But if I was to say biodiversity loss, tumbleweed, I think there is no societal consensus on biodiversity loss. Drew told us on Wednesday that we're very good at measuring for 140 years what we're losing. And that's not been through some catastrophic event, but through incremental decline in our environment around about us. Because I think society so far has not really made connections between the choices that we make as people in our food choices, in our transport, in our daily lives, and that impact on the environment. Interpretation is very good at describing that, but how good are we at provoking and inspiring the actions to change? Because once it's gone, it's gone. Now, landscapes themselves have histories, but we too have a history and how we see and value that land. Now that's equally true for protected areas. The way in which protected areas have been created and what they're for has changed over time, from originally medieval places of timber and game through to the aesthetics and the beauty of nature, to the multifunctional networks that we see today. And I think you'll see from that middle slide that the political landscape very much has changed too. I suggest you take a good look. So I thought, just to sort of help us to contemplate that a bit further, I said I'd take you on a whirlwind photographic tour of Europe to see something of the connections of people and landscape, and consider the role of interpretation in reimagining these landscapes. We're going to pop, first of all, over to France and to the Parc of Naturel Régional Montagne de Reims. It's way in the northeast of Paris. Well known, it is the Champagne region of France, a place steeped in tradition, a new cultural World Heritage Site. And Eric Rodet, whose glass of champagne you see here, has been in these vineyards, not himself personally, but for 8 generations. These people are deeply connected to their landscape. And here on the Montagne de Reims is Mont Sinai, and there is the beautiful view looking across the rolling hills and the vineyards, with the interpretation, the ubiquitous interpretation panoramic panel there. But if you kind of just look to the right of the panel, you'll see a large rock. Is this some geological formation? Is this a glacial deposit? No, it's a First World War concrete bunker, the remains of. Because here, right in this location, was the front line between the German and the French forces in World War I, during which time 70% of the local villages of this landscape were plundered, brutalised and destroyed. And on one day in 1918, 30,000 men died here. That's almost 80% of the population of Inverness. This is not on the viewpoint. This is not part of the interpretation. Today you can take a walk through that forest, where once there were very different routes just below the surface. And it's not far from the rows of vines or the rows of the lives lost. Now this is a hidden landscape in this area, and these are unspoken stories. And it's not something until quite recently that was part of the message of this area. Because the stories of the people connected to those who lived in the villages that were destroyed, and indeed those who lived in the villages that remained, they were stories of loss, of brutality, and they were often too shameful or traumatic or painful to be shared, even by second and third generation people. The scars in the landscape betrayed the scars in their memories. And as I said, it wasn't until recently when the park, gently and over the course of a year during the 100-year centenary of World War I, using storytelling and drama and other interpretive installations, began to discover and uncover these stories, that the people began to tell them once more. It was the people who reenacted their own drama. And this became much more than an interpretive history project, because for many, it was a healing and a very profound experience. And that, for me, is interpretation at its most powerful. That's the acts, the deeds, the thoughts, and the dreams that Geddes talked about. They're not always soft and cuddly. These people are now reconnected to that part of their history once more. A bit of an unusual journey for us, because I'd like to take you to Russia, but a very unusual part of Russia, the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, completely surrounded by what is Europe now. It's on the Baltic coast. Here are the Curonian Spits, a very famous national park, one of the most famous bird migratory points, in fact, in the world. But Kaliningrad was once Königsberg, part of Prussia and of Germany for many centuries. It was an agrarian and fertile landscape developed over thousands of years. full of beautiful Prussian architecture and long established complex drainage systems from the manor and small villages and farms and crops, were very much in balance with its ecosystem. As I say, one of the most productive landscapes in Europe before the Second World War. And then in 1945, this area, after the Potsdam Conference, was ceded to Russia. The entire German population were removed from the area. The villages were destroyed, and many areas were set aside exclusively for the military. Settlers from across the Soviet Union were brought here. They were housed in Soviet-style housing blocks because to live in an individual house on an individual farm was not in the communist dogma. The whole landscape and settlement structure was completely changed according to a political decision, regardless of the local conditions. And invariably, these settlers, who had no connection to this landscape and were unaware of the local conditions, didn't know how to maintain those complex drainage systems. They tilled the soil, which was traditionally wetlands, exposing the heavy clay that the crops couldn't really grow in. Kaliningrad became increasingly industrialized and relied on the food being imported in from the rest of Russia, Soviet Union at that time. But of course, with the fall of the Soviet Union, they were pretty much cut off from the rest of Russia. This was exacerbated by the emancipation of Poland and Lithuania. As I say, they're now completely surrounded by European countries. That population now of about 500,000 are completely disconnected from their country and completely disconnected from the landscape in which they now live. They're fractured from it. They have no connection to the history and culture that went before them, other than in the last 50 years. Here is just some of the evidences of environmental problems that they have in Kaliningrad. It's got one of the highest crime areas in Europe. As I said, it's got huge environmental problems. Huge drug. It's got the biggest HIV problem levels in Europe, and massive problems of alcohol and drugs and other social problems. I mean, it really is indicative of a people who are disconnected in every way. But you know, there is hope. There is hope. Because there are new shoots of ecotourism beginning in Kaliningrad. Ecotourism, you say? Why would I want to go there? Well, all of those farms that were abandoned, nature is taking over again. It's still one of the best bird migration sites in the world, in Europe, and it's still a place that Twitchers migrate to. And Germany, and I think here is the full circle. Germany in particular is investing hugely in projects to stimulate and help entrepreneurship in this country, to help better land management. And of course, it's including interpretation and in education in that. But this fractured landscape is a very extreme example, but it's not that unusual in Europe. There are other parts, in Central Europe in particular, where people are disconnected from the land in which they currently live in. And how do we help people relate to a landscape that they have no cultural or historical connection to? We need nature, and we need natural spaces. And I think sometimes we need to know that there's big wild spaces out there that we might not necessarily go to. We also need places that are a bit closer to home, so that we can get to them, to be in nature, because nature is good for our health. Human health relies on a healthy environment, and studies have repeatedly shown that contact with nature and with open spaces, with pleasing landscapes, brings a range of benefits, certainly reduces our stress, and it gives us more rapid recovery from illness. But what it also shows is that when a landscape is disturbed, it disturbs the peace of mind of people too. Have you ever gone somewhere and you've seen litter and erosion and you don't feel very good about yourself or about being in that place? So I'd like to pop back to France, if you don't mind, and tell you another story from another place, the Scarpe, the Parc Régional Scarpe-Escaut, in the Nord de Parc de Calais, in the north of France. And there they have truly reimagined their landscape, from the black of the coal mining to the green of nature. Here there was a huge decline in the mining industry, like other parts of Europe. It had been very prevalent in the region for a very long time, and it was from where people had derived a very good economy and a really strong identity. It was very much an industrial landscape. But with that decline came mass employment, social decline, high incidences, and very high incidences of mining-related lung disease and early death. And the region, Nord-Pas-de-Calais, I think, took a very imaginative decision to invest in their regional parks, not just to green the landscapes, but as a socio-economic model to help regenerate, rejuvenate, and reinvent the area. And this was despite calls for industry and jobs, as you usually get in such situations. So it wasn't just about rewilding the once industrial areas. It was about a transformation of use, not just for tourism and recreation, but a place, a healthy place for the people, so that they could use the spaces to, with interpretation and programs, to help improve the health of the people. It brought about an evolution of how the local people saw themselves. In short, I'll translate for you, to participate in a change in their views of the environment and the landscape, their view of their community, and their view of themselves. And this is interpretation empowering people. They said, and I saw some of the nice feedback in some of your presentations last night, so here's some French feedback for you. They said, and I think this is a really valuable quote here, that this was something to make together, not only to come and see. Very much of the Geddes sympathy, synthesis and synergy philosophy with the hand, the heart and the head. Another said, it's necessary not to reject our past, because obviously we need to know where we have come from in order to know where we're going. And this person also goes on to say that my father went down the mines very young and died very young. And I think that speaks of someone who's wanting to have that dialogue between the past, the present and the future to reimagine a new future. And this project spoke to people. It was a mirror for a journey into their true history. And it was done through storytelling, through dramas, through sculpture, all the good interpretation stuff. But one in particular that really struck me, because I've been to this place, was this piece of sculpture called Breath. Because it was all about taking a new breath of fresh air into this area. But it also very much resonated with the miners who had really suffered from the lung disease and the problems that brought them. And I found that an incredibly moving, very simple piece of sculpture. Again, interpretation at its most powerful. And when we think of the future, of course, we usually think of the next generation. And what will they inherit? And what will they make of it? And I've heard from many people in these days about that connection to the landscape, to nature and the experiences of them, and what we see and learn from our families as well. But we need to be careful and remember that not everyone's connection and experience of the landscape are positive, as we saw in Montagne de l'Âme and in Kaliningrad. And given our increased urbanisation in society, not everyone will even have a natural experience. Sorry, I think I've just skipped forward a little bit there. Because, I'll just repeat what I was going to say, kids need nature. I think you saw the slide there in a moment. But so do grown-ups. We need to keep a keen eye on the future. And that was something, I think, that was embedded in the European Landscape Connection, which was ratified in the year 2000 by the Council of Europe. One of the things that the UK is not leaving, I think, for the time being anyway. And that convention requires landscapes to contribute to achieve sustainable development based on a balanced and harmonious relationship between the social needs, the economic activity, and the environment. Again, very much like Geddes's valley section of interdependence. It says in the Landscape Convention that the parties, the countries, need to recognise landscapes in law. So you can go to the countries and say, hey, interpretation is needed here. You should recognise your landscapes in law as an essential component of people's surroundings, an expression of the diversity of their shared cultural, natural heritage, and a foundation of their identity. There's a heck of a lot of good work for interpretation in here. I would also point you to some of these documents. I put them on there that are on the European Landscape Convention site. There's some great and interesting case studies and ideas in them. And of course, I think, as was said earlier, I think Torsten, you mentioned it at the beginning of the conference, next year is European Year of Culture, of Cultural Heritage. I do apologise. And we in EUROPARC, certainly, like Interpret Europe, I think will really embrace that. And we'll be looking to see how we can improve interpretation in our parks. And I very much look forward to working with Interpret Europe to see how we can develop some new programmes together. One of the thinkers of interpretation, I'm sure you're familiar with, is Freeman Tilman. And I just wanted to reflect on that need for landscape and the connectivity between it, because I'm not very sure where we're going with the balanced and harmonious relationships that were envisaged in the landscape connection. And I wonder if politicians are actually thinking sustaining development as opposed to sustainable development. We need to pick them up on that. Because Freeman Tilden said that through interpretation is understanding, through understanding is appreciation, and through appreciation, protection. But I sometimes wonder what is it that we're protecting, and how we value those different things. Our national treasures or our natural treasures? Because, and forgive me, those of you from the cultural heritage and the art world, for what I'm about to do. I think if we were to leave our art treasures, our national art treasures, in the state that you see here, vandalised and damaged, there would be a huge outcry. Yet, as I said earlier, through an incremental decline in damage, we are actually doing the same to our natural treasures. And that Europe's protected areas, I think, are in danger of that we're neglecting them to death. My fellow Scots, I apologise again for what I'm about to do. The National Monument of Scotland celebrates William Wallace. It's our cultural and historical icon. You saw I grew up in the shadow of this. But what would happen if we left that damaged? Our landscapes, we can and we should celebrate our guardianship of our cultural and natural assets. But why do we leave them incomplete and damaged? What part of the story are we not telling? And I beg forgiveness for desecrating a national monument. Because nature speaks, but often we're not listening. And I think you as interpreters have an incredibly important role as the interpreters of nature and culture, and for people's relationship with nature. Even when perhaps nature isn't telling us very nice things. So what can interpretation do to tell the stories of our landscape? Well, of course, you need to know the traditions, but appreciate that cultural norms are not always fixed. Some do last forever, but new traditions are being born today. They will become the traditions of our grandchildren. Of course, be creative. I think it was that very imagination that was at the core of the success of some of the stories, some of the projects that I described to you earlier. Really do whatever you need to do to connect people to the land. There have been whole books of works written on interpretive planning, some of which written by people in this room. And I think that planning is not the enemy of creativity, but it's the path through which creativity can be directed. And of course, work with partners. We heard Pete say that a lot about the Cairngorms National Park the other day. The people whom your interpretation is about, I think, are your first and most important partners. It's after all their stories, their past, and their present that you're telling. Now, if I may borrow from our American friends, I think interpretation is of the people by the people and for the people. But remember that as interpreters, you are not an innocent, passive bystander in this. Your filters and your prejudices will also be part of the story. Because you as interpreters, I think, both inside and outside our parks, are working for nature and for culture to promote sustainability by networking and working together. Your calling is to inspire, to reconnect people to nature and to culture. And I saw again last night some of the very good feedback that people got from their projects. And that's great. Happy customers are a good thing. But what has changed? We need to refresh people's stories in order to protect and conserve our living, working landscapes. Because our landscapes enrich people's lives, and they provide a deep and inspirational sense of connection to the community and to the landscape. But be aware, though, as I said earlier, for some people that connection is fragile, broken, fractured, dislocated from their history and their culture. Now, as a geographer, I love maps. And this is one of my all-time favourite maps, Winnie the Pooh. This map is overlain with personal experiences. And I think I remember Drew talking about a project where the autistic people were helped to interpret their area through maps. But I think it's not just through the maps, it's through the personal experiences that those maps represent. So I took those green lines of my landscapes earlier and made my map of the Stirling area based on my experiences. Those green lines that connected me to my past, to my granddad, and their experiences of their landscape. And it certainly informs my present and my future. Because I think it's the topography of our memories, individual and collective, that give meaning to the landscape. And with that meaning comes those connections from our childhood, from our adult experiences, good and bad, that feeds our dreams and helps us to reimagine the landscape. Its place, its work, its folk, its head, its heart, its hand, its synergy, its synthesis. I recently became an auntie. He is, of course, the cutest child in the world. How can he not be? But he really made me think about the inheritance that I will pass to him. There's no money, so we may as well give up on that idea. But the inheritance of his connection to Stirling, to the history and the culture and landscape of that place, and to the wider world that he might explore. And of course, to his great-granddad, who was a guide in the castle. I'm going to get emotional if I go on about this too much. The place where I played in, and the place where I hope he too will play in. Because our future is the imagined landscapes, the dreams that we had as kids, the adventures, the experiences that we still have as adults too, turned into reality. And interpretation has an incredibly important role because it feeds those dreams, it feeds those imaginations. We, and I hope I can share that with you, have a 21st century responsibility of great importance to meet the challenges, to promote new and creative approaches and thinking, and to make new partnerships. It's to proclaim anew the meaning and value of the natural environment, of our culture and heritage, to expand those learning opportunities, to provoke, to relate, to reveal, to tell the stories of the people in the land, and to share that widely. Interpretation can make the past relevant to the present in order to precipitate a change in the future. And it's by encouraging and inspiring people to experience with the head, the heart, and the hand, to connect with the land. And that's how we go about reimagining our landscapes. I'm going to leave the last words to Patrick Geddes. Microcosmos naturae sedis hominum theatrum historiae utopia futuris. Our landscapes are the microcosm of nature, the home of man, the theatre of history, and the good place of the future. Thanks.